communication, discipline, woo, responsibility, and harmony. My name is Megan Nail, and I'm Vice President of the Total Rewards Practice at NFP. My biggest aha moment around learning my strengths was that one of my strengths, discipline, is a very rare strength. So I enjoy learning more about that and exploring how I've been able to use that, not even knowing it, within my daily work.
I'm Darren Virassammy.
I'm Brandon Miller.
And this is The Strengths Whisper, the show empowering leaders to create, build, and sustain great places to work. On this episode, we have Megan Nail, the Vice President of Total Rewards Practice. Megan, welcome to the show. It's great to see you.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be here.
Megan, you were introduced to the Clifton StrengthsFinder assessment. Was it through the Society for Human Resource Management? Is that correct?
It was. I was first introduced through a volunteer organization, Professional Society of Human Resource Management, and our volunteer leader group took the StrengthsFinder together to try to really optimize how we were working together as volunteers. So that was my first introduction to it.
Before we get into even diving into your strengths, what was that like, just doing it on a team building type experience for volunteers? What was that like?
It was great. What I love about the StrengthsFinder is it's so positive and really just thinking about how we can get the best from each other. I still remember that day when we got our results because our facilitator broke us into different groups to look and see who had similar strengths, who had differences. And that was just a really fun activity to kind of mix us up and get us talking about our strengths.
Absolutely. And that is oftentimes a starting point for teams, or how Clifton Strengths is seen in the world, is like, oh, it's just a team building one-off sort of an activity. It can be a fun one-off sort of an activity. What's been interesting organizationally is organizations that embrace it and fold it in to their culture and really design it by intention into the culture, to where it's not just, hey, this thing that we did at a team retreat 5 years ago and nobody remembers any of it, but actively fold it into the language and thinking about, hey, how do Megan's strengths show up? How does Darren's strengths show up? How do those intersect? How do they work together? They tend to have actually higher levels of employee engagement. So you get these spikes, interestingly enough, when strengths is introduced as a one-off, but then when it's actually baked into the culture, it creates much larger shifts. It is really powerful for volunteer teams, which is where you were first exposed to it, in nonprofits and organizations where teams are coming together and trying to get volunteers to work together. That can be a little challenging because time is pressed and people have similar skill sets or differing skill sets. And then trying to figure out within the time that we have, how do we actually work together? It can actually be a perfect accelerator in those environments. And we've actually experienced that a lot. It's a fascinating jump in from there. Now, for you, Megan, after you took it, what was one of your strengths that really stood out to you that said, oh my gosh, that's totally me? That really resonates with who I am. That's who I am today. That's who I've been. It's been in my nature. Do any of those, even in your top 10, jump out to you?
It's actually my number one. So I feel like it's kind of an easy answer. And it's interesting because your life takes twists and turns and you go different ways, and really just thinking about what's a common theme for me, it really is communication. When I came out of high school, we all have our dreams about what we might want to do someday. And like so many people, I had this dream. I was going to be a journalist, like a newspaper journalist. This is late 90s when that was a pretty good gig to have at that time. In college, I entered into communication. Although I like writing, that's not really my passion. So I ended up in organizational communication, and that's how I ended up in human resource and business. And really just thinking about the different things that I've done, speech and debate, just lots of even interpersonal communication. I taught team communication in grad school. When that strength came out on my report, I'm like, that is spot on. And I really feel like that's been a big part of what I enjoy most about my work, and also what's made me successful in different roles, but using that same strength over the years.
Very cool. And communication, the element that is fascinating about that, its ability to just quickly put ideas into words and tell the stories and connect to the tales of what needs to be to actually breathe life into something and being able to message it in a way that it's going to land and connect with people is really part of the power of communication. And it can show up in how we do that verbally in speaking. It can do that in the way that we're writing. It can do that in our ability to just look at a piece of communication. The speed at which it can do that. When we're thinking about our Clifton Strengths results, it's not that other strengths can't get to these outcomes. It's the alignment of the order of where it goes. So for us, we naturally think in terms of communication when we're looking at Megan's strengths here, right? You're naturally going to see that. It's going to be one of the first things that comes to mind when we are looking at them through this lens. In your number 2 spot, Megan, you have discipline. What does discipline mean to you? Does it mean that I should go in timeout right now? What does discipline mean?
How I take that is more of accountability and follow through. And that actually pairs with one of my other strengths, I would say, which is responsibility. So to me, discipline is really putting those processes and procedures in place for myself to make sure that I can follow through on all of my commitments. So whether it's work, volunteer, kids, just really having that discipline to really make sure that everything's followed through on. And then pairing that with communication, making sure everyone's in the loop on it too. Who needs to know what so we can get to our end result and all be accountable, and making sure everyone's coming along for the journey.
Thanks for sharing that, Megan. It is really cool how you paired discipline and responsibility. I want to talk about discipline for just a moment because discipline is actually one of the rarest strengths to have in our top 5. So having it in the number 2 spot is very unique. In fact, we just crossed over 30 million people having taken it internationally. And this strength most frequently recurs in the bottom 5, the 30 through 34, if we were to take an aggregate, a snapshot of people that have taken the assessment. So one of the things that might happen for you, and tell me if this is true for you or not, but discipline, one of the things that it naturally gravitates towards is creating order and structure that can be rinsed and repeated. It doesn't tend to love disorder and chaos and situations like that, but it has this uncanny ability in situations that are out of alignment or where there might be chaos or structure lacking to gradually do the work and keep creating structure. And oftentimes it can take the big project and break it down into the 8 or 10 or 12 micro projects and say, okay, here's what we need to do. This is going to be our focus for the next 2 weeks. And then once we finish this, we move on to the next segment. And it's able to actually do that in a way that helps create order and structure for others. And it's a piece that can come a little more naturally to us. Here's an interesting part that comes with it. Because it comes so naturally, it can sometimes be frustrating as well when we're looking and saying, well, all you have to do is just break that into 10 micro projects. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, that's funny. It really does. So my day job is I mainly lead a lot of compensation projects, and I have a team that we're doing compensation and total rewards analysis for clients, projects of all different sizes. But as our work started to grow, and as I came into that role a few years ago, I'm looking at this and saying, we need a repeatable way to do this if we're going to be efficient and get this work done. So thinking about how to break down everything from onboarding, how we educate about what our process is, and then exactly what those pieces are on a very complex project. Am I paying at market? What should I be paying? Sometimes we have projects with thousands and tens of thousands of employees. Just thinking about if we do one step and we break it down into these pieces, we will get here over the course of a couple of months. So that completely resonates with me.
Your ability to see, even if you don't see all of the projects, but to go to what are the micro projects that exist here? What are the steps that we need to put in place? The thinking naturally goes in that direction and defines it. When we feel these moments of frustration, this is around discipline, but this is around all of our strengths. Sometimes it's not a tell of somebody else's lack, but it's actually more a tell of our strengths, of what our strengths really bring to the table, which is why it comes so easy to us. When we're talking about discipline, because it's such a rare strength, it's easy to overlook how rare of a strength it is that so many people will really value the contributions that you bring. And it's something that can be easy for you to overlook and say, that's no big deal. Anybody could do this. But the truth is, anybody can't just do that. It's actually driven by that strength, and it helps create that structure for others to anchor to. And that's a big part of the value that it brings. So when we have these rarer strengths, our likelihood of having that frustration at times could be higher because few people have them. And there's also less practice in the world to utilize those and to step into them, if that makes sense. So when they see somebody that brings that, that's a lot of value that we have. So when we're in that moment, and this is important, not just for discipline, but for any of our strengths, when we're minimizing that whole contribution that it's bringing, and we're like, that's not really a strength because I want to have what that person has. That's really valuable what they do. We value what others have, but we don't even look in the mirror and see, this is why people are coming to me. What do people come to me for? What's the value that I bring? Then we can actually start seeing that's how I actually contribute. And these things that I'm saying are really no big deal are actually a big deal, and they create a lot of impact. Does that resonate? Does that make sense, Megan?
It does. It's always easier, I feel like, to see the strengths and the contributions of others. It's harder to look at yourself and just to get out of your own brain because it's from our own perspective. So that's super interesting. And I'm glad to find out I have one of the rare strengths. I didn't know that either. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that you said in relation to discipline, responsibility, and that connection to communication is your order and your structure that you're putting together. It's not just the order and structure for the box checking side, it's the people side, the communications. How is this being messaged? How are we structuring that? And when we look at your top 10 strengths just globally, there's a reason for that. So in your top 10, you've got communication and woo, which are both influencing strengths. You also have harmony, you have positivity, includer, and individualization. Those four are relationship building strengths. So 6 of your top 10 are more of people focused strengths, meaning they go from people to task. When we look at those strengths, the influencing and these relationship building strengths, they tend to look at what's the outcome that we want to get to, Megan. And they're going to look at it through the lens of what's the people side of the equation, and then what's the task and process to get to the outcome. So it's people plus task and process equals outcome. When we look at more executing based strengths like discipline, responsibility, learner, those are going to bring more of the process and the task side. And they, to get to outcome, operate under the lens of task and process plus people equals outcome. The fact that you're leaning more towards these people strengths, the influencing, relationship building, even those executing strengths that are looking for the task and process, they're going to naturally gravitate a little bit more towards how do we do the task and process through the people lens. So that's a big part of how these are going to come together. And when we understand these little nuances about ourselves and about the people that we work with and the people that we're leading, it takes us really far. And responsibility, I want to just address this. It is an executing strength. And by executing, we mean they see the blueprint. This needs to get done. We're going to do it. With it comes this lens of high values, a high focus on accountability and psychological ownership. And here's the thing. Responsibility builds relationships and trusts by executing. It does what it says it will do. It gets things done to serve and to invest in relationships. So part of how it keeps filling the trust bank account with relationships is through executing. So even though it's an execution-based strength, one that we would classify in the execution domain of strengths, it's very much focused on serving people by executing. Does that make sense to you? And does that resonate?
Absolutely. I mean, that's how I think I found my way into human resources. It's that combination of the people piece and what can we do to really serve people. But to me, at the end of the day, how we do that is by executing on things, putting systems and processes in place that support people so that they can do their best at work and they can bring their whole selves to work. So that's really in different ways how I feel like my career is developed and what I'm most passionate about.
That's a perfect segue. And that's actually where I wanted to go next, because you did touch on the fact that you were going down the journalist path in the 90s and different elements. You got into the HR world. You have a background in communication naturally as a strength. Can you connect those dots for us? What was it that drove you to get into the human resources world?
When I was originally thinking about journalism, and I pretty quickly changed from that, I just realized I didn't think that was the right career fit for me. I just couldn't see myself doing that, sticking a microphone or a note paper in someone's face after some tragedy and being part of the media. So when I looked at what the other career opportunities were that were in that area of communication, I pretty quickly turned to organizational or business communication. I always stayed in the communication field, and luckily HR is one of those professions where you can have a lot of different backgrounds and succeed. Really just found my way into that HR role. Got a great job opportunity, worked in retail HR at Target, which is a fantastic company, but that's a great opportunity to really learn the nuts and bolts of what HR is. And then as I took different opportunities and really started to develop in that area, I found my love for compensation and working with data and numbers. And I think part of it still goes back to that communication, because what I experience a lot of times is by some individuals who are more data focused, they can't explain it. They can't make it real. How do you explain it to a manager? How do you explain it to an employee? And that's really where I found my niche, is not only looking at the numbers, understanding these complex pieces, but how do you make it simple and understandable and relatable so you're making a difference to someone when you're explaining it?
That's really interesting. And when we tie that to your strengths of communication, woo is hanging out there, winning others over. And data sometimes can be really exciting for some people and really scary for others. So when we tie that back to your strengths and we think about it through the people lens to understand where the data is and understanding of where some of those disconnects might be and being able to frame it in a way that connects for people. That's really some of the hallmark of what is going to come from strengths like individualization, your number 10. So individualization in that story that you just shared, the power of the strength of individualization is it naturally picks up on those little nuances in people and has an ability to customize its approach to them. And oftentimes when we see individualization really thriving in companies and in organizations, because of that awareness, it's actually able to see how to best put people together. This talent, these strengths, the gaps that exist in this person versus the strengths that exist in this person, they're actually going to complement each other well. And it's because of this natural ability that picks up on those little nuances. When you put the power combination of your number 9, which is a ranger, and individualization together, and a ranger is kind of like a conductor of an orchestra. They're not playing any instruments. They're just going through and leading the right instruments at the right time. But when you pair that together with individualization, there's this intuitive knowing that comes when those two are put together. I don't have the sheet music as a conductor, but I know the right people to bring out now to make the symphony without even having the symphony composed, because I can see where we're headed and who's going to be needed and who has the right talent to navigate through the situation. So when we're looking at putting together the most efficient outcomes and getting the resources together, it's not just the resources in terms of the tactical stuff. There's this natural knowing on the individual side of where people are at. Does any of that resonate with you and your brand of leadership?
It does. And I think that's part of the unique role that I'm in as a professional, and the role that I have. We're often working with executive leadership teams, and even within there, the CEO might have a different need or perspective for information than the CFO. Then the director of HR has a different perspective. People managers within the organization have a different perspective. And then employees maybe have a different perspective. So when I'm thinking about how I approach communication when it comes to projects and thinking about how we put that whole plan together, one of my first steps is to really outline what all of those audiences are, and then what their key needs are, and then what those key messages are that we have to share, so I can think about how to make it relevant to the different groups that are involved.
Thanks for sharing that. One thing that I thought was really interesting when we spoke, you mentioned something that not all people make the connection to, but I thought was really insightful on you as a people first leader, in really this ability to dive in to people and to study them and meet them where they are. You said people's values can change over time, and you were able to keep a pulse on that, and I think this is really valuable for our listeners. How do you actually get a pulse from employees and in their one-to-ones to try and figure out, hey, what are they valuing right now? Where are the scales at in the value equation at this point in their life? Because there's going to be different things that impact them internally, externally, that they're going to face. And that's going to shift where those are. How have you figured out how to take a pulse and a temperature check of where people may be on that road?
First, you have to develop that trusted relationship, of course, so that there's some trust in having that conversation. But then the other piece, I think, is just asking good questions about what their aspirations are, what their goals are, what their priorities are, and using that to understand and look deeper underneath the surface on what they're looking for. Are they looking for more external opportunities to learn and grow? Are they looking for more internal opportunities within the organization? Is there something going on with their family that they need to prioritize that in a given season or period of their life? So to me, asking really positive aspirational questions about what would you like to see the next 3 months, the next 6 months, the next year hold for you? And just open it up, that personal, professional. What does that look like for you? What are you hoping to achieve? What would a successful next couple of months look like for you? And that can open that door to that conversation where I feel like as a leader, you can craft an experience around that and also help guide them through some of those experiences if it's something that you've experienced before.
Thanks for sharing that, Megan. Do you find that when you've done that on your own or when you've helped develop the leaders who are leading do that effectively, when they find out what the drivers are in their personal lives, it's creating more opportunities in the workplace to find work where that employee can be valued to where maybe their strengths or their talents could be shining, and we're discovering things about them that we didn't even know that they could bring to the table because we've just looked at their job description, put them in this box, this is what the job needs, but the organization has all these needs, and we've created some discovery paths to see what else they might be able to do and share.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest overlooked pieces in development of employees in general are internal opportunities within your organization. It's great to go to a training session or a conference and to have those experiences for sure. But there are things that we can do just within our organization by giving exposure to different things that they may not normally have exposure to. I feel like sometimes we minimize the value of those, and those are actually some of the most valuable experiences. For example, on my team, often we get called into high-level board meetings or these pieces. Even if I'm leading that, I look for the opportunity to bring a team member along. How can they listen? How can they contribute and be a part of that? And that is just as much development, if not more, if done correctly with the right setup, giving them the right experience, and then the discipline to have that debrief afterwards on what did you learn? Give me feedback. What do you see as an external party? And it really helps develop both of us.
And it also creates that lens where somebody that might be earlier in their career emerging gives them the confidence. I didn't know that I could sit across from somebody who's leading me and then share my perspective with them of what I saw that, hey, worked really well, or hey, I'm trying to understand why you did this, just so I can learn and going through it. And then that starts fusing together some of the situational awareness components that we want to develop in the next wave of leaders. When we were prepping for this interview, something you shared that really struck me. You said now is the opportunity to diversify the workforce and get to untapped talent pools. Why is now the time? What's so special about right now?
This is something I'm super passionate about. We, in the United States at least, have a huge labor shortage. We are seeing unemployment at the lowest levels that we've seen in years, despite trying for an economic slowdown. Not an economist, but we're still seeing labor force recruiting, attracting really strong. And when you look at this, it's a lot of the demographic shifts that have happened in the country that were accelerated by the pandemic. We knew the baby boomers were going to retire. A lot of that was accelerated by the pandemic. And now we just literally have a shortage of people who can do the jobs that we have available. It's a little bit of a skills shortage in some areas as well, but actually there just literally aren't enough people. So what really makes this exciting to me, even though it's challenging, and my heart goes out to everyone in talent acquisition and recruiting who are trying to fill these open positions, but I think it's forcing us in a good way to look beyond what we would traditionally look for in a candidate. I'm really encouraged by looking at more skills-based hiring, skills-based pay for that matter too, looking beyond degree requirements or things that we used to kind of use as a substitute for this person's experience, this person's qualifications. And I think it's really going to allow us to diversify and look further into individuals who are maybe have been justice involved in their past, individuals who have maybe not been able to fully participate in the workforce due to different abilities. Whatever the situation is, we need to dig deeper. And I think just the reality of the situation we have is forcing us to do that, where it might have been the nice thing to do always, but now we're forced to do it. So that's what makes me excited about it.
It's always interesting that in times that feel adverse or where we feel really challenged, there's usually incredible growth opportunities that are just taking place that we're being forced to go through. I'm a huge fan of Mother Nature as a teacher, and I gave a TED talk on this, becoming distinctive by nature and these components. One of the things that stands out to me is when you look through nature, when a storm comes through, if there's a fire that has caused decimation or a hurricane that blows through and it does a lot of damage to us as humans, to our buildings and different things like that. And it causes environmental disruption as well, stirs up the sea, rips the land apart. When you look at it in the natural world outside of what we've created in the buildings that get damaged, oftentimes when you look back at the sea in an area where a hurricane has gone through 4 or 5 years after the fact, it's come back to life in certain ways because it's brought in new nutrients, it's stirred up everything, it's brought a lot of freshness, fresh ideas, fresh way of thinking because of this force that was just brought through. You could do nothing but take it. But then when you look at the other side, it can be really prolific on the impact that it's had, even though it felt like carnage at the time. So I think Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, just keep on going, right? So when you're going through those challenging times, you keep on going. But when you look back in the rearview mirror and you look at how far you've come, you can actually create some powerful transformational change. One other area that I know has been a focus for you has been on working parents. Can you talk a little bit about what your focus has been in the working parent space and how employers can provide more creative options and benefits for people just at all stages of life? Because that's something that you're also really focused on, right, Megan?
Yeah, it's near and dear to my heart. I have two boys, 16 and 13. So I'm in that working parent category. Another thing that has come to light more and more over the past couple of years is just what can we do as employers and also as a society to better support working parents? And it goes back to the fact that if you just look at what employers need, we need more people. So how can we create flexible structures so we can encourage and provide that support for working parents in the workplace and allow them to be productive and to understand how they can contribute to what we're trying to do as employers? One of my favorite stories of an employer I worked with or had this discussion with, they were small. They had less than 25 employees. And sometimes when we think about these topics, we think of the really, really big public companies that have a ton of resources that can do on-site daycares and all these great programs. But there's some really great grassroots things. So this small employer, a role that they had required some after hours. It was like a marketing, sales development type role. So they would have to do some events in the evenings a couple times a month. And what they did was they put in a babysitting stipend. If they had a parent that was in that role, they could apply to have a babysitting stipend for those nights that they had those after hour events. And I just love that creativity. It's nothing earth shattering, but what kind of message does that send if you're a candidate for that role, that the employer understands your situation? They're trying to help in the best way they can. It's not some big fancy program that has a bunch of branding, but that really makes a difference to that person or those people in that role. So I guess my passion around it is just challenging of thinking differently And how can we really bring these pieces together to make a real difference in people's lives? Because we see so much drop off in the workforce, moms and dads, or any type of guardian or caregiver type of situation, no matter who it is, taking care of others. And it's just really unfortunate. So I just like to think about how can we help support?
I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's unfortunate on both sides for that mom, that dad, or whoever that caregiver is. And it's unfortunate for organizations that are struggling to get talent. What if you reframe the way you're looking at things? It is a full-time position that you'd like. What if you were able to get somebody that could provide 40% of the time and that's all they got? But when they're in for that 40%, you might get in that 40%. They might be willing to operate at what you would normally get at somebody who could do 60 or 70%. Maybe there's opportunities for a reframe in how we're looking at the work to be able to tap those talent pools. And this does come into our workforce development strategy. It's something that we're very passionate about as well. It's like there's a different way of looking at this. And then it allows you access to the talent pools because the talent isn't there. I think that's what you were getting at earlier. The talent is there. It's in a pool that we've put a box on because we've said this is the way that the position has to be. But one thing that the adversity of the pandemic taught us is everything that we had thought was this is the way that it has to be for work to get done got shattered. And we're now still picking up the pieces with that as we're moving into this hybrid working world that's taking place. But we also might need to think of what are the other ways that we could define hybrid from a working relationship? Because it could be that maybe we have a couple people that are holding down the fort on different elements, and the way that we engage people can open up access to some of these pools that are here because there is definitely talent. There's folks who might not be able to contribute at the level that they once were because of the life situations that have taken place. What would that mean for companies? What would that mean for individuals if those doors were opened again?
And that goes right back to our previous conversation about knowing what those values and what those changes are. Because especially when you're looking at working parents, there is a journey there and there's different steps in those journeys and everyone has their own situation. But if you give someone an opportunity, even if it's at a different arrangement, a lesser level, just as you shared, Darren, they are likely to be more loyal to you as their journey changes and they can grow along with you in different ways.
Absolutely. Question I just want to ask, it's hard to believe that we're already getting close to wrapping up here. The notion of a strengths-based approach to human development. So when we think of focusing on growing people, growing teams by focusing on cultivating their strengths and managing around their weaknesses, not ignoring them, figuring out how as a team we put together our complementary talents as to how they could work and support each other. When you think about creating strengths-based organizations, when you think about being a people-first leader, how do you see the connection between that and more of the DEI work that is starting to take place within your organizations and the organizations that you're consulting with? Do you see a bridge between those two?
I do, because I think going back to one of the first things that you shared, that was my experience too. We have to have a diversity in strengths. And if we look at this as that common vernacular and how we build teams around that, and we know that diverse teams perform at a higher level than homogeneous teams. But part of that is those strengths. And I feel like it gives a really common way that relates that we can look at when we bring individuals in with different backgrounds. We've got a common language on what our strengths are. And we can hopefully use that to build on that team foundation and how we work together and how we assign tasks and who does what, and to try to really bring it down to that level to use our strengths.
Absolutely. Our strengths, they're going to be very different. The likelihood of somebody having their top 10 in the same order as you, because we all have the same 34, they're just in different orders. But the likelihood of somebody having their top 10 in the exact same order as you is 1 in 6 billion. So our results are almost as unique to us as our fingerprint. So you and I share some strengths. We share positivity. We share learner. We share arranger. But the way that your positivity is going to show up might be a little different than mine because yours is paired with woo. And that's going to be even more outward than my positivity. There's little nuances like that. So yes, there's a lot of similarities between these strengths, but the way that they show up is going to be different. And those differences actually are an advantage because that creates a much broader perspective. And many businesses, many organizations that are growing out there serving the world, you're going to have a pretty wide client base that you're going to be serving, that you want to make an impact on, that you want to make a difference in their lives on. So it's important to understand what those elements might be. Megan, I suspect we could talk for many more hours, but I want to make sure we are respectful of your time and our listeners' time as well. So I just really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to share your story, your background with us, Megan, and for just being a people-first leader. It's clear that that is something that's at your core, not only for those that you're leading on teams, but who you're serving, how you're serving, and really thinking through that. And to our listeners, I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of The Strengths Whisperer. And I want to ask you, what did you take away from my conversation with Megan? I think we'd really love to know what that is. Just email us at Brandon, BRANDON at 34strong.com. And if you want to discover your top 5 Clifton strengths, all you got to do is include top 5 in the subject line, and we will send you a code to take the Clifton Strengths Finder assessment and get your top 5. Megan, on that note, if people want to learn more about you, connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that? And we'll drop any links that you share here in the show notes as well. But where would be the best place for them to connect with you and learn more about you and what you're doing, what your company's doing?
The best places to connect with me are on LinkedIn and Twitter. So I'll make sure that I share that and would love to connect with any of the listeners on those platforms.
Megan, I really want to thank you again for joining in for this episode of The Strengths Whisperer. And I want to thank all of you listeners so much for joining us on this edition of The Strengths Whisperer. We'll see you soon. Take care.